I'm Stan Lofchie, 94, live in Brunswick, Maine. Grew up in Wakefield, Mass. And in Boston. Well, I can remember the July 4th celebrations in Massachusetts, and it was just one great big party. It really didn't seem to me, as I recall, it had much to do with patriotism. It was just like Christmas without the religiosity. Everybody was celebrating, dancing, singing, and setting off fireworks.
Just any excuse just to have a hell of a good time, I guess.
And that's exactly what it was.
Were you politically active before the war?
Yeah, I guess I was politically active certainly by the age of 15, maybe before that. But I was still with high school at 15, and there were strong left-wing currents in the youth population, and in Boston, or many other cities too, but I certainly was well aware and involved with that part of the youth population.
What kind of things were you working on?
Well, we were working in the build-up to World War II to generate sympathy for opposition to the Nazis, which was not as simple as it sounds now. And then with the beginning of the war, to rally sentiment in behalf of all the Allied nations, including the Soviet Union.
So, were you a member of any particular party at that time, or?
Well, you couldn't join a party until you were 21, but I was part of various youth organizations that were very left in their orientation.
Yeah. How old were you when you drafted?
18.
18. You were 18 when you were drafted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what year was that you were drafted?
1943.
And where were you sent for your training after you were drafted?
Well, my first training center was the major U.S. outpost in North Carolina. The name escapes me at the moment. But my first assignment was to a special training operation called, it was to groom soldiers to be technical experts in engineering or medicine or whatever. And they were sending people to universities, and based on whatever test scores you got selected for that. So I went to that, but within a month and a half that whole program was canceled. So I was then sent to infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia. And luckily for me, I got pneumonia. So in those days, treatment for pneumonia was not as prompt and quick as it is now. So while I was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, my infantry unit moved out. So I was saved from being in the infantry, and I was assigned to an artillery outfit at Camp Rucker, Alabama. So lightweight artillery, and it was with that group that I went overseas. I think it was just sort of expected. I certainly was not in any way trying to avoid it, but it was not something I looked forward to. It was just that you were 18, you were drafted, and that was the end of it.
Yeah. So when it was time to be shipped out, did you go on a boat, or?
Oh yeah.
And where'd the boat
Well,
take you?
the boat landed in Wales, I think, but we spent some time in England before shipping off to the continent.
And where did you land when you went to the continent?
Landed in France, but I don't remember the name of the town.
And can you tell us what happened after that?
Well, our artillery unit went into the Battle of the Bulge, and that was in Belgium, I think. But we were in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Germany.
And what time of the year was it when you first got?
Cold, winter, bitter, frozen.
And you had some problem with your feet, if I recall.
They're frozen, they've never recovered.
What was the action like? What did you experience in the?
Well, I guess what I remember first was the first night. There was a truck pulling our 105 howitzer. The lights were out. It was dark overhead. I think there was somebody walking ahead of the truck with a flashlight or something. We finally pulled into position, dug in the gun. The next morning, I was really surprised to look behind me and to find that there was infantry units digging in behind us. And I thought that they were kind of mixed up, but no, the whole damn operation was mixed up. And we didn't stay in that position very long in front of the infantry, but it was an exciting 48 hours.
So how long were you actually in fighting in Europe?
I would say 5 months, but the, the, the unit that I was involved in, their involvement in the fighting in Germany was not very substantial.
Did you ever come in contact with any Allied forces, other countries' forces that were allies?
Not really. We might have had some contact with Canadian troops in the Netherlands. I do remember that we relieved Canadian troops who were well dug in the Netherlands, and we actually used the very same foxholes that they had dug. But I'm not even sure of that, Bruce.
Can you tell us what it was like to be in battle? What kind of fire you took and things like that?
Well, we took a lot of artillery fire. And I remember that one time it seemed as if our stash of 105 millimeter shells was about to catch on fire. And I remember running to the truck to get the fire extinguisher, which turned out to be an important move. But I guess my most salient memory was how cold it was and how hard it was to dig a hole to sleep in. If you dug down 12 inches, it was an accomplishment, but then you had to dig a trench so you could stretch out. Then you had to cover the trench with empty artillery boxes filled with soil so that there would be some protection. I was really very diligent in that activity, and I remember medical corpsmen wondering if I had overdone it and sealed off an air supply. But that kind of, I also remember once, oh yeah, it was very cold. We did not have real winter boots, and the overcoats that they gave us were so huge and so heavy that they were all immediately discarded. They just impeded movement so much. But the Europeans were very glad to get those overcoats. But I do remember one night we were making enough progress so that at a certain point, each member of the gun crew got a night off. And you could go to one of the farmers' houses and rest. But to actually go to somebody's house and to be confronted with a real live human being was really so attractive that I never slept at all. I just stayed up all night talking to this guy. And then...
What did you talk about?
Probably about his life and what it was like for a Belgian farmer to be surrounded by all these troops. I really can't say I have a clear memory of that. But what I do remember is that I had made the mistake of taking off my shoes to rest. And the next morning, I could not get those shoes on. So I had to walk barefoot, I don't know how long it was, 3/8 of a mile, holding my boots to get back to the gun. Else I never would have got back at all. Somebody had the ability to rip open the shoe so I could get my feet in, and that was how it went the rest of the time.
Did you know anything about, while you were fighting there in Europe, in these various European countries, Did you know anything about the war going on further east, where the Russians were, had been invaded by the Nazis? Were you guys aware of any of that whatsoever?
Yes, there was a GI newspaper. It really bothers me, I can't think of the name of it now. But it was very, very well known. And we had, I think, sometimes we saw some of it every day. And they did quite significant reporting on the Eastern Front, too.
And did you have any feelings at that time about what the Russians were doing?
Well, I mean, I was aware that they were under attack and that they were the most important front. But I can't say that at this time I know that the battle, try to remember where I was at the time of the Battle of Stalingrad. I don't know where I was then. But yeah, I'd say in general there was substantial awareness of the Eastern Front.
When you say that you thought that they were the most substantial part of the front, what do you mean by that?
Well, some of it I may not have known at the time, and I don't know exactly what point I became aware of that the Russians lost like 20 million civilians, which was more than everybody else put together, and probably a few million soldiers as well, so that they were the ones who absorbed the burden of the Nazi onslaught.
So, in general, then, you feel that the Soviet Union made a large contribution towards defeating the Nazis.
I think the word is huge.
Can you put that in a sentence?
The contribution of the Soviet Union was of the first order of importance in World War II. They absorbed the most firepower, they absorbed the most fatalities, they absorbed the most starvation. If there was any other kind of suffering that they could have absorbed, they did that too.
And do you think most of your American fellow soldiers had that same sense of the contributions of the Soviets? I mean, was that
I heard the question. I'm trying to think of what would be appropriate to say. When you say most, I think I would hesitate to say most. But I'm not even sure of that. I mean, everybody got the same daily GI paper that I got, which did very, very thorough reporting on the Eastern Front. So it would have been hard for them to miss it. But how attentive they were to the stories, I really am not sure.
And do you have any recollection of you guys sitting around talking about that?
No.
No. Today, in today's world, just a month or so ago, when everybody celebrated D-Day at Normandy, the United States was there, and France was there, and Germany was there, but Russia was not invited. Putin was not invited.
What I heard was that they took exception to Putin's remark at the D-Day event the year before. And so we didn't get invited this time. I hope that turned into a lesson, right? Well, first of all, I have to get to the part I left out before. I did not return home directly from combat. We were assigned to a vast open plain in France where our task was to evaluate the service records of soldiers who had performed at greater length and at greater risk than we did, to determine whether they should be next in the line to go home. In the midst of that assignment, there was a notice on our bulletin board that 2 people from every battalion could be sent to England for a special Army program called Training Within Civilian Agencies. I put my name down, and even though I was of the lowest rank possible, the master sergeant chose himself, and then he had to choose one other. And for reasons that I never even bothered to inquire about, I was chosen. And that really was the key event for my life, really, to get to England under those circumstances and to be assigned to various civilian agencies. My first assignment was to a place called Old Cuckoo School. It was a boarding home for delinquent adolescents. And I was a caseworker of sorts. But I didn't know what I was doing, so they sent me out to get supplies for their residents. And I went around to all the GI PXs and brought back tons of candy, which was my work and was well appreciated. Finally, my time was up there, and I ran into a guy that I knew quite well from the old days in Boston, and he told me incorrectly, but for me it was wonderful to hear, that he was now at an important desk in London that decided on the assignments of the people he encountered. Where would I like to go next? I was assigned then to a place that was a retired, or that's not the word, but a campus that had been a British military school for adolescents. It was in the town of Shrivenham. And at Shrivenham, they established what they called an American university. And in that arrangement, they brought over, a large number of American faculty. I took classes with a man who was chair of the government department of Emory University in Atlanta. I had a class with the guy who was in charge of the sociology department of the University of Wisconsin. And I had a class with a third group I can't remember. But I got through that. And then I ran into my friend again, who I had actually visited in London. He had a lot of friends in London. There were splendid parties there. And he said, well, what do you want to do next? I said, I don't know. He said, well, we're sending some people down to the Riviera to meet with Pablo Pascal. I said, that sounds, he said, that's all filled up. All we got left is the University of Cambridge. Really? That sounds all right. So I spent a term at Cambridge University. So at Cambridge, I was surrounded by, first of all, a group of Americans who had all spent a lot of time in college. I was the only guy who had graduated high school just barely. And, but there I was. I was afraid to study anything except for something I could really be literate in, which was American history. But I had a wonderful professor there, D.W. Brogan, who had written many books on American history. And that was the system at Cambridge and Oxford. You never took any exams until you were ready for graduation. But you met with your tutor every week and to review the readings that he had assigned to you the previous week. So I had private tutorial with D.W. Brogan every single week. Finally, that was over. I had a chance to stay on in Europe further, but by that time, I got a little antsy, and I feel now I made a mistake, but I did choose to go back home. I went back home. I had credentials from Cambridge and other places, and I applied to universities. Oh, the other faculty member who I ran into at Cambridge was C.W. Hendel, who at that time was chair of philosophy at Yale. And he said, if you're going back home, you should apply to Yale. And I said, Professor Hendel, if I could get into Yale, does that mean I could get into Harvard? And he said, well, yes, but why would you want to do that? And I said, because then I wouldn't want to leave home, wouldn't have to leave home. I felt I had already been away from Boston long enough. So we said, okay, if that's what you want, that's what you want. So I had letters from D.W. Brogan, I had letters from Handel, I had letters from the guy from Emory University who had a name that was a name that Groucho Marx used to make fun of. And I had a letter from the guy from the University of Wisconsin. So I was really all set. Even so, when I got back home, it was hard for me to believe that they were really going to take me at Harvard. So I applied to some other places too. And then I got a letter from Boston University inviting me to an interview there. So I went. And the guy said, "Do you really expect to go to college with that high school record?" I said, "I guess not." So I left there, I went across the river, saw the guy at Harvard, shook hands with him, and I was in.
Oh my God.
And they gave me credit for all the stuff at England, they gave me credit for a term, so I only had to do 7 terms.
And so you're home now. The war is over.
And I got married.
Okay, hang on one second. Let me ask this question. The U.S. promised Soviet Union, which took a hell of a hit in the war,
You better believe it.
that we would help them rebuild.
Oh,
But the promise was broken, and instead the U.S. created the Marshall Plan
that's right.
and helped Europe rebuild.
That's right. I was there in the Harvard Yard when he was then Secretary of State Marshall announced the Marshall Plan.
So, but the U.S. broke the promise to the Soviets that we were going to help them rebuild, and instantly they became an enemy.
Yeah, whatchamacallit, Churchill, what year was that, 49? I think even, might have been 48,
This
49.
famous,
Churchill made
Iron
that
Curtain.
speech at Fulton, Missouri, announcing the Cold War. An iron curtain is descending upon all of Europe, the Iron Curtain of communism.
And do you remember having any reaction to all that since you had seen, you'd been in the war, you'd seen...
Well, let me say this. I mean, I just was never a fan of Churchill. So, I mean, he could have told me that today was Saturday and I would have wondered about it. So that the whole idea sounded so poisonous and so unnecessary. It just sounded like trivia to me. I didn't believe that it would be taken so seriously.
But wasn't that, in a way, the origins of the...
Oh, absolutely. That was a declaration of Cold War.
Yeah. Now, after you got home and you're now getting into Harvard, miraculously or not, you get married, but you also became politically active.
That's right.
Can you discuss or share some of your
Well, yeah,
political activity then?
there was a decisively left veterans organization called American Veterans Committee. And there were chapters of that committee all over the country and especially all over the college campuses. The biggest AVC chapter in the country was at Harvard. And I was on, I forgot the term now, but the board of, I don't know, 5 or 6 people. I was on the board of that thing, and we had a left-wing agenda and pronounced it. And for one thing, we favored the candidacy of Henry Wallace for 1948. I remember organizing the address that Wallace gave at Harvard at the baseball stadium. It was my first time ever, maybe the first time I ever went to the baseball stadium, but I was helped ushering people into their seats, and this guy came up to me and was really screaming at me that I was doing it wrong. So I had no idea what was right and what was wrong. You want to sit down, sit down. So he starts cussing me out, so I said to him, "What's your name?" If he told me his name, he was director of all of athletics at Harvard, and he was in charge of every single seat in every single stadium they had. So anyways, he told me the correct way to seat people, and I followed his instruction. In the midst of Secretary Wallace's remarks, a student dressed in the costume of a Russian bear came out of the stands and approached the speaker's platform. There were various guards who chased him out, and Wallace went on with his remarks. But the story the next day was the story of the bear.
So the insinuation was that Wallace was a communist or
Oh, absolutely.
a Soviet sympathizer.
Oh, absolutely.
Was he?
Well, he was not communist, that's for damn sure. But he certainly had more regard and honor for the Soviet Union than the other candidates that were running, that's for sure.
And who won that election?
That was Harry Truman.
And did you join any political parties at that time?
I'm not sure. The Henry Wallace's party was called the Progressive Party, and I may have joined that, but I am not sure. I know I did not join Republican or Democrat.
Did you ever consider yourself a communist?
No. But I knew a lot of people who were, especially before I went in the army. There were communist youth movements all over Europe, and very substantial ones in England, Britain, France, Italy. Especially in Italy, there was a very strong communist party that probably could have won an election right after the war. But my understanding was that the Soviets at that time felt they were so weakened by the events of the war, they were not really in a position to help Italy or anybody else. So they asked the Italian group to back off. And that's certainly what happened in Italy and France and Britain.
When did you meet Lofchie and how did that happen?
Yes, I was then the chief psychologist at a child guidance clinic in Schenectady, New York. And we were a group of people from Children's Hospital who went over to this Wild West in Schenectady to provide children's psychiatric services to an area that had zero. Not even Albany, where they had a very good medical school, were there any children's psychiatric services. So we were like pioneers. So we went there, and part of the seduction for us to go over there was that we could have a bit of a private practice too. And one day into the private practice came this woman who's a very dignified, elegant lady, whose symptom was uncontrollable, filthy swearing, which was quite an embarrassment in her social set and most displeasing to her husband. So when I talked to her, she reported that she and her husband were really not on the same wavelength, to put it mildly. She had wanted a child, and he never wanted children. And now it was too late in her life to adopt. So I said, how do you know that? I never heard of that. And she said, well, that's what I was told. So I said, well, let me check that out. So I went to our chief social worker and told her the story. And I told her, I need to talk to the best adoption worker there is. She said, I don't know exactly who that is. And that was Lofchie. Lofchie was then working for Jewish Board of Guardians in New York. Talk about left-wing activists. That was Lofchie's first job after graduating from Smith. And she was a leader in a sit-down strike of the Jewish Board of Guardians, which had never seen a strike in its history. Anyway, I called Lofchie and I told her my story, and she said, well, she would check it out and get back to me. So she did, and she reported that given this woman's history and her ancestry and her age, her best shot at adoption would be to visit Sweden. Fine. So I reported that to this lady, and she said, oh, my husband wouldn't go for it. I said, well, at least we should let him know, let him have a chance to say no. So she brought him in next week, and he was somehow fascinated with this idea. It somehow appealed to his sense of elitism. So he said, good, let's do it. He was a high executive in General Electric Company, which was essentially the heart, soul, and lifeblood of Schenectady, New York. And it was no problem for him to make those arrangements. So we came in the next week, and I learned that he had started the process of building an addition onto his house for the new baby. This is before he had even applied, booked passage, or anything. He had signed on to it. And all the symptoms that this lady had vanished. She didn't have a baby yet, but she had a husband which was almost as good. So that was it. That was the end of the case. They never went for adoption. They lived happily ever after or whatever, and that was it. But in the course of this event, I met Lofchie. And I then became somehow the adoption specialist. And I got 2 more cases that needed adoption help. So I knew where to go by this time. And so Lofchie worked on those 2 cases, and they had happy endings too, very, very different kinds of stories. So by this time, I thought the next time in New York, I ought to try to meet this savior. And that was it. That's how I met Lofchie.
What are your thoughts about that war, the one you were in, and wars in general?
Well, I mean, I thought World War II was just American participation in World War II was entirely justified and necessary, crucial for the life of the planet. The wars since then have not impressed me favorably in the slightest. I think the wars in Korea and Vietnam were carried out under entirely false pretenses. It resulted in hideous damage, and with no gain whatsoever to the U.S. And the wars since then in the Middle East are even more atrocious. It's been going on for many, many years without the slightest indication of any favorable result could ever come of it. And so it's hard for me to be anything except anti-war at this point.
What is your message to the future generations?
What is my message to what?
To the future generations.
Stay alert, because it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to fight for your own survival. The present U.S. administration is the worst atrocity that has ever happened to this country, second to slavery maybe. But I would say after slavery, the current administration is the most disastrous event in American history. So the future generation is going to have to be alert and to be vigorous and to protect themselves and to protect the idea of a democracy in America.
Wow. Okay, go ahead. Your next one.
And what is your message to the Russian people?
Oh, well, I wish, first of all, to honor their heroism of World War II and to wish them the best in this recovery from the sad period of capitalism that they have had to endure. And I wish that there was something more attractive on the American side than the love affair between Putin and Mr. Trump.
Do you think there's a love affair between Putin and Trump?
Well, I wish there was a better word for it, but I'll stick with that. I mean, they certainly seem to get along very well. They certainly seem to heap praise on each other. And I don't see anything, I can't see anything constructive coming from Trump. I swear. I mean, when he could stand on his head and spin all day, it would not make a favorable impression on me. This is
Final question. When you were a soldier, during the war. What was your dream?
Boots.
That's not an easy question. I think my dream was mostly to go home. I don't forget that a substantial period of my youth growing up was under the stewardship of Franklin Roosevelt, who seemed like a very heroic figure to those of us on the left, even though we did not always agree with his policies. In contrast to what the Republicans offered, it seemed quite remarkable.
So what was your dream then during the war?
I have to tell you that my dream during the war was to go home. During the war, I also had in mind going home and getting married. I feel so oppressed by the current political scene that it's really difficult for me to anticipate favorable events. I can assure you that I have followed the political scene very, very carefully, very, very earnestly since I was 15. And I never recall anything resembling this. And there was a time prior to U.S. entry into World War II where there was a fairly active semi-fascist movement. Charles Lindbergh was a key figure in that. And there was a third party who adopted him, and that was kind of scary. But there was also an awful lot of strong pushback against that. Books were written exposing them, et cetera, et cetera. And so that they never really had a toehold on power. Well, this gang, who represents everything that Lindbergh did and worse, has quite a bit more than a toehold. They have the entire Republican Party, which was once an honorable organization. Not the one I agreed with, but can you remember Wendell Willkie, who was a guy who was able then to serve in the Roosevelt administration after the election? Very different.